So I'm Sascha Ellers, and I'm a Director of Clinical Operations. I'm from San Francisco, California.
All right, and what does a Director of Clinical Operations do exactly?
So I work with physicians and researchers to run clinical trials. I take the ideas that the clinical staff, the physicians have with a protocol, and I work to implement that protocol. So I will go out to key opinion leaders, which are most likely physicians, try to recruit them to participate in the study. I will work with data that comes out of the study, so data that's from the patients that enroll in the study, do monitoring, which is basically verifying that the data that's recorded for our study is accurate and matches what the data looks like in the patient's medical records.
I see.
And then, all of the work that it takes to oversee the study. It's a regulated environment. So it's regulated by the FDA, or if in some cases research isn't regulated by the FDA, but it's always regulated by good clinical practice and international guidelines on how to take care of patients.
So you have to actually be informed of a lot of different things to be able to carry this out.
Yes.
Now, for those people who may be slightly unfamiliar with how a clinical trial works, or even what one is, can you tell us just briefly the significance of a clinical trial?
Sure. So anytime you want to test an intervention, be it a drug, a diagnostic test, or even just changes in behavior, you want to show that there's actually a difference, you want to run a clinical trial, because that's going to give you the gold standard to show you that there's a difference with your drug or your intervention. So the clinical trial itself is a way to ask your question prospectively, design your experiment in humans, and then implement that study.
I see. So this is sort of like the, prove that it works kind of thing?
Exactly.
And this process, you said itself, is regulated by the government?
By the FDA, correct.
By the FDA. And must you pass a clinical trial to carry out your test or your diagnostic or whatever you want to do? Is that part of the requirement of ever selling your product?
It depends. So to back up, there are three phases of clinical trial development for a drug. There's phase one, where you're looking for your safety. So you got to prove that you're not going to do undue harm to people with your drug. And then in phase two, you're further refining your safety data and you're starting to look at efficacy. Mm-hmm. And then phase three are your large efficacy trials, where you're treating a lot of patients with the drug at that point. So that's kind of the basic methodology. But then within that context, it is regulated by the FDA. They do have a say in what they're going to accept from the phase 3 trials as something that they are willing to approve. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of effort goes into putting together a study that's going to meet their requirements.
It sounds like it takes a lot of time to do this.
Yes.
So it's sort of a big commitment from anybody interested.
Big commitment for companies. A lot of resources go into these trials. In academic settings, a lot of resources will go into these studies as well.
For the type of clinical operations that you manage, or that you're that you work with, can you give us an idea of the time frame that you end up working on? Like how long from start to finish for any given project does it take?
No, that's a good question. So it takes many, many years to go from start to finish. So you're looking on order of 7 to 10 years.
Wow.
But within one study, a big phase 3 study, that can take 3 years, 5 years. Sometimes when they're these longitudinal studies, they're lifetimes. So they do take a long time.
Wow. So your portfolio just keeps going on a single project then.
Yeah.
What can you give us an example of any kind of specific product or diagnostic or anything that you're familiar with or that you worked on at some point that sort of went through this process?
Yeah. So a recent example that's been approved is a drug called Zelboraf that looks at a mutation in the melanoma cancer. It's called V600E. So it looks at this mutation and says if the patient is positive for this mutation, if the cancer is positive for this mutation, this would be a good drug for the patient to try. And if they don't have the mutation, they're probably not going to respond to the drug at all. So this is a great example of using genetics in a clinical study to select patients. But you can also use the genetic information to stratify patients if you want to compare patients with the marker to those without. So it would just be a marker that would be used to look at how you could break apart those two groups to look at who did better or not in that case.
Right, and you said, so that's an example of something that sort of went through this process and has been approved?
Yes, exactly.
In general, for a lot of groups that bring products through clinical trials, do you see an increase in the use of genetics to actually either bring these products through, or to stratify groups like you say, or just generally bring more possible products to market by using genetic information?
Absolutely. I think this is really the opportunity. Is part of the problem with clinical studies is that you're confined to the population that you're testing them in. So sometimes we'll see a signal when we look at the entire data set. There'll be a signal in a subset of patients, but you don't really know why, and you've wasted a lot of money on a negative trial. One of the opportunities that genetics provides is to help us get the right patient on the right trial, so that it increases the likelihood that we're going to have a positive outcome for the trial and decreases the risk to the patients or subjects of being exposed to treatments that aren't going to help them. So I think that that's one of the most exciting things about the future of personalized genetics in looking at developing drugs and treatments.
So in general, do you think there's going to be a big increase in the number of either individual companies that are sort of doing this, as well as the need for people who understand and can carry out this kind of job?
Yeah, and I think that the old paradigm of the big pharma and having these very large studies is going to shift towards running smaller studies in targeted populations of people that have markers that could indicate that the drug is going to work for them. Because a lot of that data can come out in early clinical trials or even preclinical trials, and it's just going to make it a much more streamlined process to get those treatments out there.
So tell us a bit more about your background. How did you get to be a director of clinical operations? What did you study in school? What did you do before you got here?
Yeah, so I have a bachelor's degree in biology. When I finished school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I feel really lucky that I found this world of clinical studies. So I started out in a CRO, it's a contract research organization. So these are companies that serve pharma companies by helping to run the clinical trials. So it's outsourced to that group. And so I had my first job in a company like that, and from there came into biotech and pharma and diagnostics, and have found it to just be a lot of fun. I like to solve problems, right? So it's a great place to apply that.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a very fun sort of problem-solving or puzzle-solving scenario.
Exactly.
Tell me a bit more about the methodology of the study, how you set it up.
So all studies will have a protocol. It's the core of the study. It's documents written before you even start. It has information about the background of the clinical question that's being asked, eligibility, so what patients would be appropriate to enroll in the trial, and then it has information about things like every procedure that's going to happen and all the data that's going to be captured. And finally, it has a prospective data analysis plan. So you know when that data is available, how you're going to analyze it.
Okay.
All that's important so that we're being really targeted and going after a clinical question that we've really thought through. So yeah, so once we have the protocol complete, then that has to be reviewed by an ethics board. So that's an IRB, an institutional review board, and they make sure that the research is appropriate. So our number one is protecting patients. That includes really not just protecting them from harm in the study, but also protecting their privacy. So there's all kinds of HIPAA, the health insurance, oh gosh, am I gonna, health information portability. Do you know what HIPAA stands for? And Protection Act, yeah.
Act, I think.
Yeah, I always get the,
yeah.
So anyway, so there's all kinds of considerations that have to go into that piece with making sure that patients are protected.
So in general, let's go back to sort of one of the examples you mentioned.
Yeah.
You know, for example, that there is, let's say, a genetic marker in an individual that says something about how they're going to deal with this drug or that drug or something like that. When you go through your selection process for the clinical trial, is that information, I mean, how private is that information to you as you're trying to direct the clinical trial? Do you know the name of the individual and you know exactly what genetic makeup they are that causes this, and then you either use or don't use them?
No, it's a huge issue that the industry is really struggling with. We do everything we can to protect patient privacy, so when we are looking at genetic information, it's de-identified. So all of the identifying information is stripped.
Okay.
But that's challenging because what is identifying information? And so it's been really an interesting thing to be part of, this evolution in having more genetic information available and trying to make sure at the same time that we protect patients' privacies as we go after these questions.
Mm-hmm.
So de-identification is kind of at the core of how that would work. And we would, in a role like mine, I don't get patient names. There's a single de-identification step that happens where the patients become a number, and then a second de-identification step that happens with the genetic information.
Mm-hmm.
So we work really hard to protect patient confidentiality.
What, aside from the privacy issue, how is this sort of new age of personal genetics and sort of the advance of, I guess, whole genome sequencing, whole genome information, how do you foresee that changing the role that you have to go through in this sort of pre-selection or selection process in a clinical trial?
So the short answer is I don't know, but you can see so much potential, right? So there's this Spit for Science from 23andMe. Mm-hmm. So patients are self-selecting based on their history to participate in that trial. And I can see a world where patients would look at their genetic information and then be able to self-select into clinical trials based on, the markers that they're seeing. We're not there yet. It's not happening yet. There are lots of ethical questions that have to be addressed on that road, but I think it's really exciting.
So it sounds like you really get to, in your job, you really get to sort of be exposed to a lot of ideas and subjects that deal with genetics, but you also really get to sort of, I guess I like the verb wallow in the ethics too, and really have to be concerned about procedure. Mm-hmm. You have to pay attention to detail. Mm-hmm. You've got to sort of know technically what's going on, but you've also got to be able to remember where you are and what you're doing with regards to, okay, this is a human study and these are all the things we have to go through.
Yeah, exactly.
In general, how would you describe, how difficult is this job, do you think, compared to other jobs? Or
it's difficult probably in a different way than somebody who's actually crunching the data. Mm-hmm. We have to think through problems. Like sometimes we'll have a study that it's well designed, it could yield great data, but we just can't find the right subjects that want to join the study. So then a lot of effort goes into recruitment planning for the study. I've never worked on two studies that have the same problems. They're always different. So, and then, it builds on itself. You learn, okay, we got to have recruitment plans in place before we start the study. We've got to think through how we're going to ensure quality data before we start the study. And all of these things that kind of become part of the methodology. But yeah, every study has its own issues and the landscape changes. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting from that regard. But I don't know if it's harder than any other job.
Sure.
Yeah.
What would you consider is probably your favorite moment so far in the kind of work you've done? Just sort of, if you can describe like a great moment or a really positive side of something you've experienced.
Yeah, it's always exciting when you see something you've worked on that's approved by the FDA. Early in my career, I worked on a drug called Sutent. I worked on a phase 1 study of Sutent in gastrointestinal stromal tumors. And so when I saw that it was approved, that was really exciting. I also worked on a drug called pertuzumab. It's called Perjeta, and it's approved for metastatic breast cancer. So that's been exciting.
Yeah. Wow, that's very impressive.
So there are just these little, those things happen. But of course, those drugs were approved many years after I was done working on them. But yeah, so you never know when you're working on something where it's going. And you just deliver your little piece of the puzzle and then other people take over. That's both frustrating and also kind of cool, but because you can see in the end, looking back, oh yeah, this is how the work I did on that phase 1 or phase 2 study, fit into the big picture. So, yeah.
So equally then, excuse me, what would you consider one of the, I guess, hardest or most frustrating aspects of your job then would be?
I've also worked on studies that did not end well, where we unblinded data and found that patients were being harmed, which is never a good thing. But I'll say in that particular case, the company and the ClinOps group I was part of did a very nice job of immediately stopping the study, notifying all of the physicians of the problem, and doing what we could to make sure that the patients were no longer exposed to a treatment that was not treating them, was hurting them.
Right, I seem to remember in the news not that long ago, I only have a peripheral knowledge base of certain clinical trials, but I do seem to remember one about statins that was a big study, and apparently, I hope, correct me if I'm wrong here, but like if you know, but I think there was like a big benefit to like people who were at risk for a heart attack. If they were either on or off the statin, it really decreased their risk significantly. And it became such an ethical imperative. It became so obvious so early in the clinical trial that this worked in this way that they stopped the trial early and said it's unethical to not give the statin to everyone in this case.
Yeah, that's a great story. It doesn't happen that often. And I'm not familiar with that example, but yeah, that's very cool.
But I think what's nice is, when we hear a story like that or other types of stories, you're sort of a face behind all of that, right? You were in the process of planning that clinical trial.
Yeah, and somebody in clinical operations was working very diligently to make sure that everybody was informed of the decision to stop the study, and that all of the, like I said, this is in some ways a very controlled methodology. So we would have to let IRBs know that the study was stopping, and make sure that all the pieces were put in place to wrap it up.
So how much of your job would you say is sort of teamwork?
A lot of it's teamwork. Partnering with physicians and researchers and colleagues doing the same work I do. I would work with people in a commercial organization. Of course, there's the huge financial components. You're working with people that have budget responsibilities. Yeah, there's a lot of teamwork that goes into it.
Is there anything else you want to talk about related to clinical operations, or anything else that you think would be really interesting or relevant to genetics or just the job itself?
Yeah, I think that what's interesting right now is the movement towards personalized healthcare. I want to see how personalized genetics fit into that. So I just think it's an interesting time to be in this field.
If somebody's watching you right now and they're super excited, they're like, wow, that sounds like a really cool kind of job, what advice would you give them to either learn more, or what advice would you give them to learn more, or to possibly become a clinical operations director themselves?
I know it's a tough field to break into, because a lot of people are interested in getting into this type of a field. So I think it's really getting work experience. There are degrees, there are master's degrees, and there are great programs through like a UC Berkeley or UC Santa Cruz that'll give you a certificate in clinical trial management. And those certificates are great. People learn all of the methodology behind how to run the studies, but it really comes down to doing it and working on studies, which happen both in an academic and a drug company, diagnostic company, now personalized genetics companies. So there's so many different places you could get this experience. So I guess that the main advice would be not to just focus on drug companies, to look across the board for other places that are running studies and see if there are opportunities there.
Would you recommend anybody who's interested to try to get work experience before school experience in this?
I think work experience is the foot in the door that will help to land the job. Yeah.
And what kind of work experience exactly?
So they're entry-level positions running clinical trials. It's called a clinical trial associate.
Okay.
But also background in a physician's practice where they're running studies is another great way to get exposure to it. And I think that it's not, a lot of people focus on getting into a drug company, and I think that might be the wrong first step to take. It's definitely something to put on the list of things to do eventually, but just to break in and get the foot in the door, working in other capacities is probably easier to land the first job.
Yeah, it sounds like to carry out a job like yours, they want somebody who's very knowledgeable, and you got to know the ins and the outs. And it sounds like you might gain that better by, like you say, sort of getting your foot in the door and maybe taking a lower level position on a clinical trial or clinical operations development program first.
Right. I mean, you have to be able to interview for these bigger jobs. You have to be able to talk about the mistakes you've made, right? And what you learned from those, which you can't get unless you're actually doing this work. So yeah, there are other angles to get in than just going through the drug companies.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and wish you the best of luck continuing your clinical operations.
Thanks.